Teacher discovered that her 12-year-old autistic student was her biological son. When the judge asked Ann Harrison if she was prepared to hear the results of the DNA test, she hesitated. For 3 eternal seconds, the 12-year-old boy beside her wrung his hands nervously. Everyone in the courtroom knew these results weren't about a simple custody dispute. They were about a lie that had lasted for 12 years. The scent of floor wax and old paper filled the courtroom. The dark, heavy wooden benches groaned under the weight of the tension. Anne felt cold sweat trickling down her back, staining the simple blue blouse she had chosen to appear humble. Leo drummed his fingers in the rhythm he always used when he was anxious. Her lawyer, Miss Amanda, breathed heavily beside her. Michael Thompson watched everything in dead silence, his fists clenched on the polished mahogany table. The judge's voice cut through the air like a blade. The results confirm Leo is the biological son of the petitioner. Anne wasn't there as a dedicated teacher. She wasn't there just defending a special student. She was there because she had discovered that the man she had been sleeping next to for 15 years had stolen her own child from her. Michael stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair because he knew other secrets were about to spill out. Leo began to rock his body back and forth because he sensed the emotional chaos around him, but couldn't fully process the meaning. Jessica, Anne's best friend, covered her face with her hands because she had harbored suspicions for years and now saw her worst fears confirmed. But this story didn't begin there. On that cold Tuesday morning at the New York County Courthouse, it began 12 years ago when 2 babies were born on the same night at NYU Langone Medical Center, and someone decided the fate of 2 families needed to be altered. The truth had layers Anne didn't even know existed. To understand how Anne arrived at that impossible moment, you need to know 3 intertwined stories. The story of 12 years ago, when it all began in the maternity ward. The story of 6 months ago, when the first suspicions arose. And the story of 1 week ago, when the truth finally exploded. It all started on a rainy September morning. If you want to know exactly what happens next, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Thousands of women are already part of this community. Don't be left out. 6 months before that day in court, Ann Harrison woke up every morning at 5:30. Her modest 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side was always impeccable. At 38, she carried the subtle marks of life, a few lines around her brown eyes. Brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and an upright posture that revealed determination. Her hands, always careful, showed small calluses from writing so many reports and adapted activities. Anne was known to everyone as the teacher who never gave up on any child. Patient beyond any normal measure, she had a rare quality. She saw potential where others saw only limitations. But this same kindness sometimes blinded her to dangerous signs. She trusted too much, forgave too quickly, and always believed people had good intentions. It was a flaw that would cost her dearly. For years, Anne had carried an invisible wound. After Jacob's birth, the doctors confirmed her greatest pain. She could never get pregnant again. The emergency C-section had irreversibly damaged her uterus. She had built high emotional walls around this loss, never speaking of it even to Jessica. The dream of being a mother to several children died on that operating table 12 years ago. Her deepest desire, kept in the back of her heart, was to feel that inexplicable connection between mother and child again. In her dresser drawer, hidden under scarves, she kept the first baby booty she had bought for Jacob. It was her secret symbol of hope that one day, somehow, she would again experience the fullness of maternal love. It was on a March morning that Anne met Leo for the first time. The 12-year-old boy had been transferred to her special education class at the Trinity School. When he entered the room, shuffling his feet and avoiding eye contact, something stirred in Anne's chest. Leo had messy brown hair, large expressive eyes, and a peculiar way of moving his hands when he got nervous. He sat in the back desk and began arranging his pencils in order of size, repeating the movement several times. "Leo," Anne said softly, approaching slowly. "Do you like to draw?" He didn't answer, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. Anne took a blank sheet of paper and placed it in front of him. "You can draw whatever you want. There's no right or wrong here." For the first time, Leo looked directly at her. For 3 seconds. But it was 3 seconds that changed everything. Anne felt something she hadn't experienced in years. An instant, inexplicable connection. Over the next week, Anne developed a special routine with Leo. She arrived 15 minutes early every morning to prepare activities adapted specifically for him. "Leo," she said one Thursday, "you are very special. I'm going to take care of you here at school, okay?" Leo didn't respond verbally, but he nodded slightly. "I promise I will always protect you," Anne continued, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "You will never be alone as long as I'm here." The Trinity School occupied a 3-story building in the heart of the Upper West Side. The classrooms, had hardwood floors that creaked softly when the students walked. The characteristic smell of chalk mixed with cleaning supplies permeated the hallways. Large windows let in abundant natural light, creating golden reflections on the light blue walls. The inner courtyard had well-tended gardens where children played during recess, and the constant sound of laughter echoed through the halls. The school's social hierarchy was complex and sometimes cruel. Wealthy parents influenced administrative decisions through generous donations. Teachers competed for recognition and better positions. Students were categorized not just by academic performance, but by their family's socioeconomic status. Anne, with her modest special education teacher's salary, was at the bottom of this pyramid, but that never intimidated her. The unwritten rules of this world included: never publicly question the board's decisions, always maintain an impeccable appearance during school events, and understand that certain families had special privileges. Anne followed these rules out of necessity, but internally she fought against a system that prioritized money over the well-being of children. She fit into this world like a misplaced puzzle piece. The first signs that something was wrong began subtly. Anne noticed that Leo always arrived late on Mondays, and his backpack often came with a broken zipper or damaged straps. When she asked about it, he would get agitated and start flapping his hands compulsively. "Is everything okay at home, Leo?" she asked one morning. He just pointed to a drawing he had made, a house with shuttered windows and no visible door. In the faculty lounge, Anne began to hear strange comments about Leo's family. "That boy's lucky to have such a dedicated stepfather," commented the English teacher, Vera. "Michael Thompson is an admirable man, taking on a child that isn't his." Anne frowned. Stepfather? She'd always assumed Michael was Leo's biological father. "What do you mean, stepfather?" she asked. Vera seemed surprised. "You didn't know? Leo was adopted as a baby. Michael married the biological mother afterward." The last afternoon of peace, Anne remembered, happened on a Thursday in April. She had prepared dinner for Michael and Jacob, lasagna, the family's favorite. The table was set with the best china, and candles created a warm atmosphere. Jacob, now 12, chattered excitedly about his day at school. Michael seemed relaxed, smiling as he poured wine. "Are you happy at work?" he asked Anne. "Very," she replied, having no idea that her happiness was built on a terrible lie that would soon shatter completely. It was precisely this natural maternal dedication that would lead Anne, weeks later, to make the most dangerous decision of her life. 2 weeks after that conversation in the faculty lounge, Anne received a phone call that would change everything. It was Tuesday, 8 at night, when her cell phone rang, displaying an unknown number. "Anne Harrison?" The female voice trembled. "My name is Dr. Helena. I worked at Niu Langone 12 years ago. I need to talk to you. Urgently." Anne sat on the edge of the bed. "About what?" The doctor took a deep breath. "About the babies born in September 2013. About what your husband did." Anne's heart hammered violently. Her hands were shaking so much the phone almost fell. "What babies are you talking about?" Dr. Helena's voice came out in a desperate whisper. "Leo is not his adopted son. He is your biological son. Michael swapped the babies in the nursery. I was threatened to stay silent all these years, but I can't take it anymore." Anne felt the floor disappear from under her feet. Nausea rose in her throat. "That's crazy," she whispered. "Why would he do that?" The answer came, sharp as glass. Because Leo was born with autism, and Michael wouldn't accept having an imperfect child. Anne couldn't sleep at all that night. Lying next to Michael, she watched the man she thought she knew. He snored softly, completely at peace, while her life fell apart. 1,000 questions exploded in her mind. How did he manage to do it? How many people were involved? Did Jacob know anything? And Leo, her, Leo, was he really her son? The possibility was simultaneously impossible and perfectly logical. That inexplicable connection she'd felt at their first meeting, the physical resemblance she'd never consciously noted, the way Leo responded better to her than to any other teacher. The next morning, Anne arranged to meet Dr. Helena at a discreet coffee shop downtown. The doctor showed up looking thin, aged, with deep dark circles under her eyes. "I kept proof," Helena said, pushing a manila envelope across the table. Documents, altered hospital records, emails exchanged with Michael. Anne opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of the baby's identification bracelets, medical reports with visible erasures, and screenshots of conversations that clearly showed the conspiracy. "Why did you agree to this?" Anne asked, her voice thick with contained rage. Helena began to cry silently. "He threatened me. Said he'd destroy my career, that he'd invent medical malpractice charges. I had just graduated. I had massive student loans. I was a coward and I was desperate." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. But when I heard you were Leo's teacher, that you had met without knowing the truth, I couldn't live with it anymore. You deserve to know. Leo deserves to know his real mother. Anne confronted Michael that same night. She waited for Jacob to fall asleep before entering the home office where he worked. We need to talk, she said, closing the door. Michael didn't even look up from his computer. Not now, Anne. I have reports to finish. She threw the photos onto his desk. Now, Michael. He finally looked up. The blood drained from his face when he saw the hospital documents. For 5 full seconds, only a heavy silence filled the room. Who gave you this? His voice came out low and dangerous. That doesn't matter, Anne replied, surprised at the firmness in her own voice. Is it true? Did you swap our babies? Tss. Michael stood up slowly. You don't understand. Tss. Leo was defective. I couldn't accept a son like that. Not after everything I've built, the family my parents expected me to have. Anne felt disgust rise in her throat. Defective? He's a child. Our son. Michael slammed his hand on the desk. He was not the son I wanted. Anne's initial attempt to resolve this quietly failed miserably. She went to the school's headmistress, Dr. Patricia, hoping for institutional support. I need your help, Anne said, explaining the whole situation. The headmistress listened in silence, her face growing increasingly closed off. And she finally said, these are very serious accusations. Michael Thompson is one of our biggest donors. Are you absolutely certain about this? The disbelief in her tone was clear. I have proof, Anne insisted, showing the documents. Patricia barely glanced at them. This needs to be handled in court, not here. And in the meantime, I suggest you maintain professional distance from Leo. 2 days later, everything escalated violently. Michael showed up at the school with his personal attorney, Dr. Raul Ferreira, one of the most expensive defense lawyers in New York. They met with the board in a closed session. Anne was not invited. When they finally called her in, she found Michael sitting comfortably, smiling with confidence. And Dr. Ferreira began in a velvety voice, my client is very concerned about your mental state. He believes you are suffering a nervous breakdown, creating fantasies about events that never happened. Fantasies? Anne almost shouted. I have documents, I have witnesses. Michael finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled. You have papers that anyone could have forged. And an unemployed doctor with a history of psychiatric problems. Who do you think people are going to believe? It was in that moment that Anne realized the extent of the power she was up against. Michael had money, connections, and years of a carefully constructed reputation. She had only the truth, and that felt dangerously insufficient. The situation worsened when the nurse, Vera, appeared. Anne had discovered through the documents that Vera was also involved in the baby swap. She arranged to meet the nurse in an empty parking garage. You have to testify, Anne pleaded. You have to confirm what Michael did. Vera looked around nervously. I can't. He pays me to stay quiet, and he promised consequences if I talked. Anne grabbed her arm. A child is suffering. My son grew up away from me. Vera pulled away sharply. And my son? Who's going to feed my son if I lose everything? It was then that Anne discovered a crucial detail. While talking to Jessica about the whole situation, her friend mentioned casually, but wait, if Michael swapped the babies, who is the other baby's mother? Jacob's. Anne froze. She had been so focused on Leo that she hadn't considered it. If Jacob wasn't her biological son, whose was he? The answer came from more digging into the documents. Another woman had given birth on the same night, but she had died in childbirth. Her baby was left with no family. Michael had seen a perfect opportunity. Anne had her first small victory when she managed to access the hospital's DNA records through a preliminary court order. The judge assigned to the case, moved by the story, authorized paternity tests for everyone involved. The results will be ready in a week, her lawyer Amanda informed her. If they confirm your suspicions, we'll have a solid basis for criminal charges against Michael. Anne hugged Leo that afternoon after school. The boy allowed the hug for exactly 4 seconds before pulling away. But it was 4 seconds of pure hope. The first dramatic turning point happened on a rainy Friday. Anne was at home when she got a frantic call from Jessica. Turn on the TV, quick, Channel 5. Anne obeyed and felt her blood run cold. A video was playing on a loop on the news. Security camera footage from NYU Langone from 12 years ago. Though grainy, it clearly showed Michael talking intensely with Dr. Helena near the nursery. The date and timestamp in the corner confirmed it, 2 hours after the babies were born. The reporter dramatically narrated about a possible scandal involving a wealthy businessman and a baby swap at an elite maternity ward. The video went viral within hours. Parents' groups on social media exploded with theories and outrage. The hashtag #JusticeForAnne began trending nationally. Parents from the Trinity School called the administration relentlessly, demanding clarification. Journalists camped out in front of Michael's house in the school. Anne found herself at the center of a media firestorm she hadn't asked for or expected. The immediate consequences were devastating and complex. The school board, under intense public pressure, placed Anne on administrative leave until the situation is resolved. Michael hired an entire PR team for damage control, spreading alternative narratives and questioning the video's authenticity. Leo began to have more frequent meltdowns, sensing the chaos around him without fully understanding what was happening. And Jacob, finally found out the truth in the worst way possible, through cruel comments from classmates at school. But what Anne didn't know was that Michael was already preparing his most devastating counterattack. And in the next 2 weeks, everything she knew would crumble in ways she never imagined possible. The nurse, Vera, finally broke her silence on a Sunday morning. She showed up at Anne's apartment door, her eyes swollen from crying, clutching a yellowish folder. "I can't do this anymore," she said in a broken voice. "My daughter asked me yesterday if I was a criminal. She saw it on the internet." Anne invited her in, making coffee while Vera poured out years of pent-up guilt. "Michael paid me $50,000 back then. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life." Vera revealed details no one else knew. "There was a third person involved," she said, trembling. "Dr. Mario Augustus, the chief of obstetrics. He falsified the official records in exchange for an anonymous $2,100,000 donation to renovate the hospital wing." Anne scribbled down every word frantically. "And Jacob's biological mother? Did she really die in childbirth?" Vera shook her head. "Claudia Santos, 22 years old. No family. No one." Michael saw the perfect opportunity. A baby with no one to question him. The folder Vera brought contained photographs she had secretly taken in the maternity ward, including a clear image of Michael holding the newborn Leo with a visible expression of disgust. "I knew one day I might need this proof," Vera confessed. "I kept it all these years, knowing Michael could destroy me if I spoke, but also knowing that if the truth ever came out, I'd need to protect myself." Anne held the photograph with trembling hands. There was her son, minutes after his birth, being rejected by his own father. After Vera left, Anne finally allowed herself to break down completely. 12 years of a life based on a lie. 12 years loving a son who wasn't biologically hers, while her real son grew up away from her, suffering because he couldn't understand why he didn't fit in with his family. Anne locked herself in the bathroom and cried for hours, a visceral cry that came from the depths of her soul. It was pain, anger, betrayal, and grief mixed into an indescribable agony. When she finally managed to stop, her face was swollen and her eyes as red as if she had been physically assaulted. She recorded a confessional monologue on her phone that night, needing to externalize the feelings that were consuming her. "I always knew there was something different about me as a mother," she whispered to the camera. "I always felt like a piece was missing. Jacob was a sweet, obedient boy, but I never had that instinctive connection with him that other mothers described. I blamed myself, thought I was defective. Now I understand. My mother's heart always knew the truth, even when my mind didn't." Jessica arrived an hour later and found Anne still recording, speaking into the void about years of guilt and internal questioning. Jessica held her friend and offered a perspective Anne needed to hear. "You didn't lose 12 years, she said softly. "You saved Leo. If it weren't for your maternal instinct, your natural dedication, he could have suffered so much more. You were put in his life exactly when he needed you." Anne looked at her friend through her tears. "But I failed Jacob too. He grew up feeling like something was wrong, and now he's found out in the worst possible way." Jessica took Anne's hands. "Jacob knows you loved him the best way you knew how. True love doesn't need DNA." 3 days later, Anne decided to learn more about Michael's past. She hired a private investigator, Robert Silva, who specialized in financial crimes. What he uncovered revealed a man even more disturbed than she had imagined. Michael had grown up in a family where appearances were everything. His father, a conservative and cruel businessman, had publicly disowned a nephew with Down syndrome, cutting off family ties completely. "People like us cannot afford imperfections," was a phrase Michael had repeated several times in conversations secretly recorded by disgruntled employees. The investigator revealed that Michael's obsession with perfection came from deep childhood trauma. He'd been constantly humiliated by his father for any sign of weakness, developing a pathological need to control his public image. When Leo was born with clear signs of autism, Robert explained, Michael saw it as a personal failure, as proof that he wasn't the perfect man he'd always tried to be. Anne began to understand that. While it didn't justify his actions, Michael was also a victim of a toxic family system that valued appearance over humanity. But the moral complexity of the situation became even more apparent when Anne discovered something shocking. Michael had genuinely tried to be a good father to Jacob. Investigations showed he had invested enormous sums in education, therapy, and opportunities for Jacob, trying to compensate for the guilt of what he had done. He truly loves Jacob, Robert said. In his own twisted way, but he loves him, and he's genuinely afraid of losing him. Anne realized that Michael had his own wounds, his own fears, and that perhaps he had made a terrible choice motivated by desperation, not just cruelty. Meanwhile, the case gained national attention. Talk shows debated ethics in maternity wards, experts discussed parental rights, and autism advocacy groups mobilized in support of Anne and Leo. Hashtag Justice for Leo became a national movement, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of discrimination against special needs children. The public pressure on Michael mounted exponentially, and his company began to lose major contracts due to the negative association. Mothers' groups on social media split into factions. Some defended Anne unconditionally, others questioned why she hadn't noticed signs sooner, and a third group debated whether Michael could have been motivated by a genuine, if misguided, love for both children. The discussions became so intense that several long-standing friendships ended, and the case became a character test that divided entire families. Anne began to receive cruel messages online. "What kind of mother doesn't recognize her own child?" one comment asked. "You're just as money-grubbing as he is," accused another. "If you were a real mother, you would have felt the difference." Each message was a stab in Anne's already wounded heart. She stopped reading the comments. But Jessica continued to monitor and report the most aggressive ones to the platforms and authorities. The pain of being publicly judged for a situation she hadn't created was almost unbearable. The situation with Jacob became critically delicate. After discovering the truth, he shut down completely, refusing to speak to Anne or Michael. He spent days locked in his room, only leaving for school, where he was constantly approached by curious classmates and disguised journalists. One morning, Anne found a letter from him on the kitchen table. "I always knew something was wrong. Now I know it was me. I'm not anyone's son. I'm just a mistake that happened." Anne ran to his room, but Jacob had climbed out the window and disappeared for 8 hours, eventually being found by the police sleeping in a public park. Then something happened that no one expected. Leo started to talk more. Not a lot, but short phrases directed specifically at Anne. "Teacher Anne good," he said one morning. Leo likes Teacher Anne, and one afternoon, Teacher Anne is. "Mom?" Anne was speechless. She knelt to his level and replied softly, "Would you like me to be?" Leo looked her directly in the eyes for 5 full seconds, an eternity for him, and nodded slightly. That moment gave Anne a strength she didn't know she still possessed. But the unexpected complication came when a fourth person entered the story. Juliana Santos, the cousin of Claudia, Jacob's biological mother, who had died in childbirth. Juliana showed up with a lawyer, claiming she had a legal right to Jacob as she was the true mother's closest blood relative. "Claudia told me about the pregnancy before she died," she said at an impromptu press conference. "She wanted me to take care of the child if anything happened to her." Anne faced a devastating moral dilemma. Fighting for custody of Leo, her biological son, was clear and justified. But Jacob, he had been deceived just as she had been a victim of Michael's manipulations. And now a biological relative wanted to raise him. Would it be fair to fight to keep Jacob from his real family? Or would it be another act of selfishness, similar to what Michael had done 12 years ago? The difference was that Anne genuinely loved Jacob, but did that give her more rights than DNA? Anne tried to resolve the situation by talking directly to Juliana, but the meeting was disastrous. "You raised my nephew on a lie," Juliana accused her. "Claudia died not knowing her son would be stolen." Anne tried to explain that she had also been deceived, but Juliana wouldn't listen. Jacob deserves to know his real family, his real history. The boy was present in the room and heard everything, his eyes filling with confused tears. Later, he locked himself in his room again, and Anne heard muffled sobs through the door. Anne's attempts to resolve everything peacefully failed completely. Juliana filed for custody of Jacob. Michael hired the best lawyers to keep custody of both boys, claiming Anne was too unstable to raise any child. The legal battle became a 3-way war, with each party fighting for different combinations of custody. Jacob and Leo became trophies in a legal dispute that neither of them fully understood, but both felt the devastating emotional weight of. The situation worsened daily. Anne was losing weight drastically, sleeping only 2 or 3 hours a night. Jacob continued to withdraw emotionally. Leo began to have behavioral regressions, returning to being almost completely nonverbal. Michael became more aggressive and controlling, hiring private security to protect the boys from negative influences. And Juliana mobilized family rights groups, turning the case into a symbol of justice for orphan children. It was then that Anne realized a terrible truth. In her fight to reclaim her maternal rights, she was repeating some of Michael's same mistakes, putting her emotional needs above the children's well-being. But this realization came too late. The damage was already done, and an even bigger storm was approaching. But Anne didn't know that Michael was already preparing his final, cruelest move, and in just 48 hours, everything that remained of stability in her life would be completely destroyed. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from right now. Seriously, I read them all and make a point to answer each one with so much love. Your participation means everything here. Michael's final move came on a gray Monday, and arrived home after a preliminary hearing to find her apartment door forced open. Inside, everything had been methodically turned upside down. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered, furniture overturned. But the worst was yet to come. The court summons on the kitchen table informing her that she had temporarily lost all visitation rights to both Leo and Jacob, based on evidence of mental instability and obsessive behavior. Michael had obtained a restraining order claiming Anne was harassing the children and creating a toxic emotional environment. The empty apartment echoed with the silence of total loss. Anne sat on the living room floor surrounded by the wreckage of her life, and for the first time in weeks she couldn't cry. It was a pain too deep for tears. Her children, both boys she had loved, each in his own way, were legally forbidden from seeing her. Jessica arrived an hour later and found her friend still in the same spot, staring into space, catatonic. "Anne," she whispered, kneeling beside her. "Let's get out of here." Anne shook her head slowly. "There's nowhere to go. I've lost everything." The isolation that followed was devastating. For the first 48 hours, Anne stayed at Jessica's, but she couldn't get out of bed. She didn't eat, didn't speak, just stared at the ceiling, playing out mental scenarios where everything had gone differently. "If I hadn't investigated, Leah would still be near me at school," she murmured to herself. "If I'd been more discreet, Jacob wouldn't have found out so brutally. If I were a better mother, I would have seen the signs sooner." Guilt consumed her like acid, eroding any sense of self-worth that remained. In her darkest moment, Anne recorded a series of voice memos to herself, a desperate way to process the pain. "I've ruined everything." Her voice came out choked and almost inaudible. "I tried to be the hero, but I became the villain. Michael may be a monster, but at least the boys had stability before I blew everything up. Jacob hates me. Leo is regressing. Juliana is right time an intruder in all of their lives. Maybe the only motherly thing I can do now is just disappear from their lives." The internal monologue continued for hours, Anne brutally confronting every decision she had made. Why didn't I get counseling when I started to suspect? Why didn't I protect the boys better during the process? Why did I turn our private pain into a public circus? Each question was a blade cutting deeper into already open wounds. Jessica found the recordings on Anne's phone and was terrified by the level of emotional self-destruction her friend was experiencing. It was Jessica who brought the first light into the dark tunnel. "And look at me," she said, holding her friend's shoulders firmly. "You didn't ruin anything. You exposed a lie that was destroying 3 children, Leo, Jacob, and the little girl you used to be who dreamed of being a real mother." Jessica pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of Anne. "Leo's talking more since he met you. Jacob finally knows the truth about his origins. And you found your biological son. These are not failures, they are healings." Jessica shared a perspective Anne hadn't considered. "Remember when we were little and you always said you wanted to be a teacher to save lost children? You haven't failed at that. You found the most lost child of all, your own son, and you brought light into his life." Jessica's words touched something deep in Anne, a memory of purpose that had been buried under layers of guilt and despair. "But now I've lost him again," Anne whispered. "And I've lost Jacob too." "No," Jessica said firmly. "You planted seeds of true love in both of them. Seeds don't die because of storms. They grow stronger." She showed Anne a series of videos she had found online. Other parents of autistic children sharing how Anne and Leo's story had inspired them to fight better for their own kids. "You didn't just save Leo, you saved hundreds of children whose parents saw your courage and decided to love better." Anne began to see her situation through a different lens. Maybe her journey wasn't just about getting her children back, but about breaking cycles of rejection and prejudice that affected countless families. "Leo spent 12 years believing he wasn't fully loved," she reflected aloud. "Jacob spent 12 years not knowing his true history. I spent 12 years with a void in my heart I never understood." Michael broke 3 lives with one selfish decision. The seed of hope Jessica had planted began to sprout when Anne received an unexpected call. It was Miss Amanda, her lawyer, with surprising news. "Anne, the nurse Vera got something important." She secretly recorded a conversation with Michael 3 years ago, where he confesses the details of the baby's swap. Amanda's voice trembled with excitement. "It's irrefutable proof. We can get the restraining orders dropped and likely win not only custody of Leo, but also press criminal charges against Michael for forgery and kidnapping." For the first time in days, Anne felt energy returning to her body. "Why did Vera keep this recording for 3 years?" she asked. "She said she always knew she might need to protect herself someday," Amanda explained. Michael had started making subtle threats again, implying that if she ever talked, he'd make sure she never worked in any hospital in the country again. Vera recorded the threats as a life insurance policy, Anne made the bravest decision of her life that night. She called Michael directly, something her lawyer had strictly forbidden. "Hello?" His voice sounded surprised. "Anne, you shouldn't be calling me." His voice was calm, but Anne detected Anne's underlying nervousness. "Michael," she said with a firmness that surprised herself, "it's over. I have the recording of you confessing everything to Vera 3 years ago. I have the threats you made to keep her quiet. I have the original medical documents showing the swap." There was a long silence on the other end. When Michael finally spoke, his voice had lost all its arrogance. "What do you want?" Anne took a deep breath. "I want my children back. I want you to confess publicly. I want you to pay for 12 years of lies." She paused. "And I want you to get psychological treatment because what you did wasn't just a crime, it was a sickness." Michael tried a desperate bargain. "And you don't understand the consequences. If this becomes criminal, it's not just my life that'll be destroyed, it's Jacob's too. He'll grow up knowing the father who raised him as a convicted felon." Anne closed her eyes. He was still trying to manipulate her, using Jacob as a shield. "Jacob will grow up knowing the father who raised him finally chose to do the right thing," she replied. "It's never too late to start being an honest man." Anne hung up and immediately called her lawyer. "Amanda, I want to file every possible charge tomorrow morning, and I want to request an emergency hearing to reverse the restraining orders." Her voice was firm, decisive. "I also want it to be public. No closed-door settlements, no protecting Michael's reputation. Full justice." She spent the night drawing up a detailed plan, not just to get her sons back, but to ensure other families never went through what they had. Anne decided she would sue not only Michael, but also Nayu Langone Medical Center for negligence and complicity. She would create a foundation to support families of special needs children facing rejection. She would turn her pain into a greater purpose. The next morning, Anne dressed carefully, a simple but elegant navy blue suit. Hair pulled back in a tight bun, minimal but flawless makeup. When she looked in the mirror, she saw for the first time in weeks not a broken victim, but a female warrior ready to fight for justice. "Leo," she said to her reflection, "Mommy's coming." And it was then that Anne did what no one expected. She organized a press conference for that afternoon, inviting every media outlet that had covered the case. The final confrontation was about to begin. And this time she wasn't just fighting for her children, she was fighting for every child who deserved unconditional love. The press conference took place in the Teachers Union auditorium at 3 o'clock. More than 50 journalists crammed into a space designed for 30. Cameras pointed at the small stage where Anne sat beside her lawyer, Amanda, and the nurse, Vera. The air was charged with expectation. Anne adjusted the microphone, her hands surprisingly steady. "Thank you for coming," she began, her clear voice echoing through the room. "Today I will present definitive proof that Michael Thompson criminally orchestrated the swap of 2 infants 12 years ago." Amanda projected documents onto a large screen behind them. Original hospital records appeared side by side with doctored versions, the differences glaring even to an untrained eye. "Here," Amanda pointed with a laser, "you can see where names were altered, where birth times were changed, where signatures were forged." Camera flashes exploded constantly. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Anne continued, relentless. "And now, I will play a recording from 3 years ago where Michael Thompson confesses the details of the operation." Michael's voice filled the auditorium through the speakers. "Vera, you need to understand it was necessary. That child, Leo, he couldn't be my heir, not with those limitations. I did what any father would do to protect the family legacy." Vera's voice answered, trembling, "But Mr. Thompson, you separated a mother from her biological child." Michael laughed coldly on the recording, "and never knew the difference. And she never will if you keep your mouth shut as we agreed." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Then it exploded into a cacophony of voices. "And how do you feel hearing that? When will you file charges? What do you want to happen to Michael now?" Anne raised her hand for silence. "I want full justice. Criminal, civil, and moral. But more importantly, I want my children." Her voice broke slightly on the last phrase, the only evidence of emotion she allowed to spill over. Witnesses in the room felt chills. This was the moment that would change everything. Michael tried to control the damage immediately. 40 minutes after the press conference, he called his own press meeting, flanked by his expensive lawyers. But this time, his usual confidence was visibly shaken. Sweat glistered on his forehead under the harsh lights. "That recording was taken out of context," he began, but his voice was unconvincing. "I was discussing hypothetical scenarios with Nurse Vera. The reporters didn't buy it. Mr. Thompson, the recording is very specific. How do you explain the forged documents? Are you admitting you swapped the babies?" Michael's first real resistance came when he threatened to sue Anne for defamation. "My client has irrefutable proof," Amanda responded immediately through an official statement. Any attempt at intimidation will be seen as obstruction of justice. The tension escalated when Michael tried to use his political influence to delay official investigations, calling contacts in the city government, offering strategic donations, mobilizing his network of power. But this time, the public pressure was too strong. No politician wanted to be associated with the man who swapped babies out of prejudice. The tension peaked when Anne and Michael met face-to-face for the first time since the press conference. It was at an emergency hearing 3 days later where the judge would rule on reversing the restraining orders. Michael entered the room with his army of lawyers, but his eyes avoided Anne completely. She, on the other hand, stared directly at him, never breaking her gaze for a second. The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Harrison, please approach the bench." When they stood side by side before the judge, Michael finally looked at Anne. What she saw in his eyes wasn't just fear or anger, but something more complex. Shame. "Michael," Anne said in a low but firm voice, just loud enough for him to hear, "you stole 12 years of my life. 12 years from Leo. 12 years of truth from Jacob." Michael opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Why?" she continued. "Why couldn't you just love your son the way he is?" Michael finally found his voice. "Because I'm a coward," he whispered, the words coming out with difficulty as if each syllable caused physical pain. "Because I was raised to believe perfection was everything. Because I was afraid." Tears began to well in his eyes, shocking everyone in the room who knew his reputation as a cold man. "I looked at Leo in that nursery and I saw all of my own failings reflected. I saw I wasn't the strong man I always pretended to be, and I couldn't handle it." "You destroyed lives out of fear," Anne said. But her voice now carried a different tone, not of pure anger, but something closer to sorrow for the broken humanity of the man before her. "You hurt Leo, Jacob, me, and you destroyed yourself in the process." Michael nodded slowly. "I know, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." "But Anne," he looked her straight in the eye, "at least let me see Jacob. He may not be my biological son, but I love him. That is real." The judge intervened. "Mr. Thompson, given the evidence presented, I'm inclined to remove all your custodial rights over both boys." Michael turned pale. "No," he whispered. "Please don't." But the judge continued, relentless. "Your actions constitute serious crimes. Forgery, kidnapping by subterfuge, obstruction of justice. A full criminal investigation will be opened immediately. Until its conclusion, both children will be placed under the temporary custody of Ms. Harrison with supervision from social services." The room erupted in murmurs. Michael fell to his knees right there in front of everyone, tears streaming freely now. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I'm so sorry." Anne looked at him, the man who had destroyed her life, who had stolen her son, who had lied for 12 years and felt not satisfaction or revenge, but only a tired emptiness. Justice was being served, but it didn't bring the joy she had imagined. The immediate consequences were swift and definitive. Michael's company lost multi-million-dollar contracts within 48 hours. Shareholders filed lawsuits for damage to the corporate reputation. NYU Langone Medical Center faced federal investigations into its ethical practices. Dr. Helena and nurse Vera had their medical licenses suspended pending trial, but with a recommendation for leniency given their voluntary confessions. Dr. Mario Augustus, the former chief of obstetrics, was arrested trying to flee the country. Jacob and Leo were finally released to see Anne on a Thursday afternoon. The meeting took place in a neutral social services room with psychologists present. Jacob entered first, his eyes red from recent crying. "Mom?" he said hesitantly. Anne opened her arms and he ran to her, hugging her with desperate strength. "I'm so sorry for everything," he sobbed. "No, my love," Anne whispered, stroking his hair. "You have nothing to be sorry for. None of this was your fault." Leo entered slowly, his hands flapping in his familiar pattern of anxiety. Anne knelt to his level. "Hi, Leo." He didn't look at her directly, but said in a low voice, "Teacher Anne is real, Mom?" Anne felt tears roll down her cheeks. "Yes, my love. Mommy has always been your mom. Since the very first day you were born." Leo processed this for several long seconds. Then for the first time in his life, he voluntarily moved forward and hugged someone. The hug was stiff, awkward, but real. And Anne felt the broken pieces of her heart begin to mend. Jessica watched it all through the one-way mirror and cried with joy. Amanda, the lawyer, smiled for the first time in weeks. Even the psychologists present had to discreetly wipe away tears. It was a complete catharsis, the moment they had all waited for, suffered for, and fought to reach. Justice had been served, truth had triumphed, and true love had finally found its way. But the story doesn't end with a victory in court, because 3 months later the long-term consequences still had to be faced, and new, difficult decisions awaited Anne. 3 months after the trial, Anne's life had transformed in ways she never imagined possible. She had moved to a larger house in Westchester, with 3 bedrooms and a small but welcoming garden where Leo planted flowers every morning. The boy still had his communication challenges, but he now spoke in complete sentences when he felt safe. "Mommy, look," he'd say proudly, showing off each new flower that bloomed. Anne spent hours there with him, simply sitting on the grass, watching her son discover the world at his own pace. Jacob had made peace with his complex identity. He continued to call Anne Mom, but he now also visited Juliana every other week, learning the history of Claudia, his biological mother. "It's weird," he confided to Anne one night, "but I think I can have 2 stories. The story of where I came from, and the story of who raised me." Anne held him tight, proud of the maturity he was showing. Juliana, for her part, dropped the custody suit after realizing how much Jacob loved Anne, agreeing that stability with regular visits was what was best for the boy. Michael was serving a 3-year prison sentence for forgery and obstruction of justice, but he had been granted supervised visits with Jacob once a month. The first visits were tense and silent, but gradually father and son began to rebuild a relationship based on honesty for the first time. Michael began intensive therapy in prison and wrote long letters to Anne asking for forgiveness. Letters she read but rarely answered. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but the anger had subsided into something closer to sad acceptance. Jessica remained the unshakable rock in Anne's life, helping with the children, organizing the new house, and being the aunt that Jacob and Leo needed. Nurse Vera received a suspended sentence in exchange for her crucial testimony in community service teaching. Medical ethics at universities, Dr. Helena lost her license permanently but found purpose working for nonprofit organizations fighting for the rights of special needs children. Amanda continued as Anne's lawyer, now focusing on setting a legal precedent to prevent similar cases in the future. One Saturday morning, Anne woke up and made breakfast for her 2 sons. Jacob helped make pancakes while Leo arranged the silverware by size on the table, his particular way of contributing. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and vanilla. Golden sunlight streamed through the windows. It was a scene of absolute normalcy that 3 months prior had seemed impossible. "Mom," Jacob asked while flipping a pancake, "are you happy now?" Anne paused, considering the question carefully. "I'm learning to be," she answered honestly. Real happiness isn't the absence of pain. It's peace in spite of it." Leo ate his pancake in silence. But in the middle of the meal, he did something extraordinary. He looked directly at Anne and said, "Mommy, I love you." These were words therapists had said he might never be able to express verbally. Anne froze, tears instantly filling her eyes. "I love you too, my son. I have always loved you. From the very first second you existed." Jacob smiled, discreetly wiping his own tears. It was a moment that symbolized not just their journey, but the complete transformation they had all experienced. The scene contrasted perfectly with that terrible day in court 3 months earlier. Then Anne was surrounded by lawyers, judges, and tension, fighting for the right to be a mother. Now she was simply being a mother. There was no perfection, no guarantees, but there was real love and truth finally exposed. "You know what I've learned?" Anne said to the boys as they cleared the table together. "Family isn't about blood or legal papers. It's about choice. Every day, choosing to love, choosing to show up, choosing to fight for what's right." Anne had founded the Leo Harrison Institute, an organization dedicated to supporting families of autistic children and those with other special needs. The first office was her own living room, but it had already raised enough funds for its own space. "I turned my pain into purpose," she explained in a recent interview. "Every family we help honors not only Leo, but all the children who were rejected for not fitting into impossible molds of perfection." The Institute offered subsidized therapies, support groups for parents, and legal advocacy for families facing discrimination. Anne's internal transformation was even more profound than her external one. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. That true motherhood transcended genetics and included daily choices of unconditional love. That forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but freeing herself from the weight of bitterness. "I could have let the anger consume me," she reflected in a talk to a women's group. "I could have spent the rest of my life as a victim, but I chose to be a survivor. And then, I chose to be a warrior." And what about you? Have you ever had to fight for something everyone said was impossible? Have you ever had to completely rebuild your life when it fell apart? Many of us know the pain of discovering that truths we believed in were lies. We know the weight of difficult choices between justice and peace. Anne's story reminds us that it's never too late to seek the truth, that true love always finds a way, and that our greatest strength comes from vulnerability transformed into purpose. Share your experience in the comments. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between the comfort of a lie and the pain of the truth? How did you rebuild afterward? Your words might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today. You are not alone on this journey. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if this story touched your heart. Next week we'll bring you the story of a grandmother who discovered a family secret kept for 40 years. Remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when your hands are shaking. See you soon, and may you find your own strength in the stories we share here.